Welcome to our podcast, Journey into the Future of Medicine. I'm your host, Bill McHugh, Chief Executive Officer of the Jacobs Institute. We are a nonprofit medical device innovation center here in Buffalo, New York. Here we talk about what is possible in the next quarter century of medicine and healthcare, based on a report we published titled The Future of Medicine.
Due to COVID-19, this episode was recorded through an online platform, which accounts for differences in sound quality. Today we welcome Josh McHugh, Chief Executive Officer of Attention Span Media, a creative agency with offices throughout the U.S., made up of strategists, technologists, designers, and futurists. Josh began his career at Forbes magazine, where he opened Forbes Bay Area offices and reported on the geniuses and billionaires in the tech industry in the early 2000s. He was also a contributing editor at Wired magazine and a writer for Vanity Fair, Outside, and other prestigious publications. His journalistic work included first-person accounts of stints as a test subject in a NASA hypergravity experiment, and in a 6-month attempt to dunk a basketball in Dunkamentary, a documentary that screened at the 2009 Cannes Film Festival. Josh graduated from Yale with a BA in English. Welcome, Josh, and thanks for joining us from your San Francisco offices this afternoon.
Super happy to be here, Bill.
It's great to have you, Josh. It's great to be in your company again. First, I'd like to take our listeners back a little bit to give you some context. Our Jacobs Institute board chairman, Mr. Jeremy Jacobs, and the Jacobs Institute commissioned Josh's company, Attention Span, and a team of futurists to author and design the Future of Medicine report, which we released in late 2017. It outlines what is possible in medicine and healthcare in the next quarter century. It's a thought-provoking read that considers all facets of technology, medicine, social forces, and more. There was so much interest in the report that we began a lecture series that we host in conjunction with the University of Buffalo Jacobs School of Medicine. This year, the lecture series took place in the form of a webinar as a result of COVID, and we had hundreds of people participate, and we talked about the very COVID pandemic. We've also launched this podcast, and so it's wonderful to have you, Josh, with us on this episode. So I want to start out with the first question, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are wondering, what exactly is a futurist?
It's a great question. Been asked it several times. I've asked it myself many times. I think a futurist is somebody who looks at what's happening currently at the edges of what people are familiar with, and then uses that information to build scenarios for the future. It's somewhere between an art and a science, right? Because you have to be able to generate full worlds, if you will, based on the information that you're picking up today.
So is there any sort of training? How does one officially become a futurist?
I would say I can't think of any better training to become a futurist than to be a journalist. That's really what we've found helps people develop the ability to, again, take disparate pieces of information and weave them together into a scenario that makes sense.
Can you tell our listeners, how did you go about tackling this thing? It's a challenging subject, the future of medicine. I mean, what was the creative process that you guys went through?
Well, it's very tough at the very beginning. The first real big hurdle is choosing what the categories are going to be, what the different focus areas of the report would be. And so if you know what a writer's room in Hollywood looks like or works like, where you have a whole bunch of folks sort of around a table, it would basically alternate between getting our team together in a room and having half-day long arguments, supported by whiteboards and lots of internet research on the spot, and then going out into the world and digging for the evidence that would back up the scenarios that we were putting forth. So that's the hardest thing is to decide on, of all the different directions you can go in, to boil it down to 10 or 12 to do a report around. One really helpful component of that was that I can't remember off the top of my head how many times, but it was multiple times that we would come back to the folks at the JI and say, hey, here's the list of areas that we think are super promising for exploration. Here's why. What do you think? And then we would get feedback. And most of the time, we would get one or two sort of additional ideas. Like, okay, that looks great. Not sure what that is. Have you thought about this? And then we would add that to the list. We'd go out and investigate it. We'd interrogate it, argue about it. And, a few times through that process, we had our areas of focus.
Yeah, I just have to ask. I mean, in that process, and I do recall you coming back to us on numerous occasions. I mean, in the process when you would go back again to sit around the table with your colleagues, other futurists, did you find that the JI was somewhat innovative in the way they saw the future of medicine? When you would come back, I mean, was it always a good experience? Those discussions.
Well, it was interesting because everyone on our team for this project has been a journalist in the past, and we wanted to be very careful to make sure that we weren't focusing only on things that were connected to the JI, but with Nick and Adnan and the rest of the team there leading the innovation in quite a few places. The challenge became to us to find other people that were doing things as innovative as those folks were. So, yeah, the way to put it succinctly is every time we would come back with something that we thought maybe would be a bit out far in the future, we would be surprised by how quickly the JI folks would connect the dots to something that they already had underway. And they would shorten the time horizon on those different scenarios significantly.
The conversations were always very thought provoking. I think the admiration went both ways. So just getting a little bit more into the nuts and bolts here. So how did you ultimately identify? What were the key factors of the forces of change in this report? I mean, how did you settle in on what you settled in on ultimately?
Well, so you mentioned the forces of change, and that's a really important component. So one sort of set of coordinates that we started out with was this idea of, yes, these are the promising areas of investigation. And then what we would do is sort of cross-reference those with what we call the forces of change. And those are various emergent technologies or socioeconomic forces and trends that are driving the change and accelerating change, especially when they combine with each other. So that's what we basically look at what we saw happening in different areas of medicine and then talk about which of the forces of change were the most relevant to that. And to do that, we actually did multiple rounds of ranked choice voting, not just with our team, but with sources of ours as well. We'd have them in and do, have sort of panels go through these intersections of forces of change and current phenomena in the industry. So I would say the sort of the granddaddy of all the forces of change that we looked at would be Moore's Law, because so many different, what we call forces of change are really, offshoots of Moore's Law. So if you look at, sensors, you look at blockchain, you look at, smartphones and 5G, mixed reality, all that stuff is made possible, on top of Moore's Law. So that we had those, and then we had the social forces as well. And so we would go through all these different areas, talk about what forces are affecting them the most, and then that would help us craft the shape of each section of the report.
Interesting. It's probably, it might be an unfair question actually, but just before we get more into the actual report itself, was there anything in that process that didn't make it into the report that you reflect back on now today and say it probably should have been in the report? And you might not be able to recall, because I know you do a lot of work in this area and it was 3 years ago, but just curious if you can recall anything.
I mean, I would say the things that didn't make it in just because they were too we didn't see enough evidence yet for those becoming realistic situations. So one of the really, really hard things to figure out was sort of what is going to happen with information systems in healthcare. That was something that we spent a huge amount of time on. It's it's basically the way that the healthcare industry works. It's also the way that it malfunctions in a lot of senses.
Right.
If we could have figured out what the perfect healthcare information system would look like, we'd probably be we'd be hosting our own podcast empire right now, because everybody would want to know how we did it.
Yeah. Perhaps most notable, and truth be told, we've had a few episodes which call this out. But the chapter Pandemics Arms Race predicted, as you know, a global pandemic by the year 2040. I think we could all say now that this could not have been more accurate, clearly. Can you share for our listeners' perspective now that we are experiencing this? Is it what we're experiencing how you envisioned it would be? I mean, is this what you thought was going to happen?
Well, what we're experiencing is definitely a result of the same dynamics that we saw bringing on a pandemic. I mean, what we were looking at was the rise of megacities, climate change, population exploding, and business and leisure travel getting to levels where there was just so much interaction with people all over the globe, and just the velocity of international interactions that's what we were looking at when we came up with the idea to really look at what a pandemic would look like and how you might go about protecting people against future pandemics after that. We sort of thought it's going to be hard to rally people to put in place a really robust pandemic prevention system, which would require a lot of international cooperation, a lot of investment. But we did think that once there was a pandemic, there would be a lot more eagerness to be prepared for the next one.
So are you saying that in your work that you really didn't see the kind of priority from a global collaborative perspective that you would expect given the potential magnitude of a pandemic? You didn't see that in your research. Do I understand you correctly? That's
right. Basically, individual countries were very good at. Some of them were very good at being ready, having a plan. I would say the U.S. actually did a fantastic job at keeping Ebola contained, and there was a brief scare that it might get loose in the U.S. There was a lot of awareness, but just not the international spirit of cooperation and reliance on science that we saw being necessary to really be fortified against it.
You did predict, I think, in that chapter that countries would come together and collaborate and through science come up with a solution. And I'm hoping that ultimately is going to be the case. I know that there are, I believe at this point, over 180 vaccines that are developed, several that are fully enrolled, and I gotta believe, set aside all the political rhetoric that the scientists and the great industries across our globe are working collaboratively to solve this problem. Would you agree that is now happening or not?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the devastation that COVID has wrought has definitely mobilized the best and the brightest in the world to get after the problem. So it'll in 2 to 3 years, I think there will be really strong systems of detection and prevention of spread in place, and it'll be a different world.
Yeah, I agree. So Josh, do you think the pandemic and all the subsequent lockdowns and the various different opinions about how to address this are affecting our ability to maintain good pace around achieving other things that we call out in the Future of Medicine report?
I would say the hardest thing would be to identify which things that we talked about in the report have not been accelerated. So we feel like COVID has cut several years out of the runway toward a lot of these scenarios. I mean, telemedicine, completely off the charts, out of necessity, right? And just a lot of other areas as well. Just robotics have gotten a big boost just because the danger of having healthcare workers exposed, to patients has helped people, I think, make a lot of decisions to invest. So pretty much everything in the report has been accelerated. There's one section of the report called Trickle Up Innovation, where we talk about how developing countries out of necessity have innovated in ways that enable them to produce solutions to healthcare challenges much cheaper than in the States or in the developed world. And we've seen a lot of that. We've seen a lot of really interesting stuff coming out of Africa. And interestingly, in Africa, they actually probably had a head start on us because they've had their own epidemics over there that they had to react quickly and effectively to. So that's accelerated a lot, the amount of developing world innovation that we're seeing. So yes, pretty much everything got accelerated in the 9 months in our rearview mirror.
When we prepared this report, just give us a sense of what type of global collaboration did you embark on? I mean, did you step outside the U.S. to get perspective on this thing?
We did. When we would find an issue in the U.S. healthcare system, we would look around to other spots for inspiration or for examples of how systems had enabled different countries to solve problems that we've currently got. I mean, on that one, I would go back to the Trickle Up Innovation chapter and just say that what we did is we went down a large list of things that are sort of very expensive and in the U.S. system, and looked around the world for different examples of ways that the same solutions were being delivered for a lot less. So, to go through a couple examples, you've got blue light therapy for jaundiced babies in the first world. At the time, it was we were looking around $3,000 for per treatment, and we looked around and found a machine that uses LEDs instead of CFL bulbs, and it's $350 a treatment. All kinds of stuff. ECG machines, the big GE ones that we were looking at are 15,000, and then we found one that was under $400. So just looked all around the world and found places where entrepreneurs and innovators were coming up with new approaches to things that are that keep people from getting treatment just out of sheer cost.
Would you say that you found healthcare to be better than in the U.S. and other parts? You hear this all the time that not only is healthcare in the U.S. expensive, we all think it's the best in the world, but is it? I mean, did you see instances where you could actually document that healthcare was being delivered better in other parts of the world than it is here in the U.S.?
Definitely. I mean, on the maternal mortality rate, that was a bit shocking to comprehend when we really looked into it, how far behind a lot of the rest of the world the U.S. is. So that was surprising. There were a lot of countries that were far ahead of us on just taking care of women in childbirth. I'd say that was the most striking one, actually. But yeah, there, and then there we could see a lot of trade-offs too, where in the U.S. maybe some procedures were either not approved yet, and there were countries that we saw folks going to get these treatments. So there was the medical tourism angle that we ran into, and a lot of that is just market dynamics. When people know that there is a technology or a treatment that is in demand and they can't do it in one country, they'll go to where they can do it. And so yeah, that was fascinating to see that happen.
So much of what's in this publication is still very thought-provoking even today. And I guess I would just have to ask the question, and I know we're running out of time here. It's been a great discussion, but I just have to ask this question. When you and your fellow futurists sit around a table and think about when's the next right time to write the next version of the future of medicine, how much time is it? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? I mean, what does your gut tell you?
My gut tells me 3 to 5 years. I would say, the year after, you sort of sit back and you wonder if these scenarios that you came up with are actually going to come to pass. Year 2, you're kicking yourself on a few because you projected them 20 years out, and now you're seeing that it's probably going to happen in 10. And then by year 3, there's just so much more to do in every focus area that everyone's dying to get back into it. Everyone who's on this team constantly sends each other, news reports and research papers and stuff like that to say, I was right in that argument. The augmented reality contact lens, that was a big argument on our team when that was going to be a reality. But look, it's going to happen in 2 years. It's going to be on the market. I told you so. So there's a lot of that going on. But 3 years, I think, would be a good time to revisit these things. And you mentioned before things that didn't make it into the report. There's also areas of focus that didn't make it in the report, not just particular technologies or different pieces of different forces of change. There's also places that the gaps between these areas as they move into the future that open up, and there's entire new fields to look at.
You've had a fascinating career, Josh, and you've experienced and done so many different things. I just have to ask, what chapter would you say was the most exciting one to write?
I would say I still find the work on regeneration, on regenerative medicine. I just turned 50, so I'm pretty fired up to see another 50. And that was a lot of fun, and it was a nice sort of lift toward the end of the report, to come out of it on a really high positive note, to look at a lot of the different technologies that are extending life, and not just extending life, but improving life at a later date than anyone's ever been able to contemplate. Exciting. I thought there was the work on what we call previvors was actually really exciting. It's basically what's happening is with the new levels of transparency that people have into how large institutions and systems work. People are able to get much more information and to really take part in their own treatment and into sort of planning out how they're going to attack a condition they have or an injury they've suffered. And so I think that's the most exciting thing, where you've got these large groups of patients, or even more interestingly, potential patients, right? Folks who have had their DNA analyzed and know that they're at a high risk for a certain condition. banding together and applying pressure just through their numbers on either pharmaceutical companies or on the government to do something to help their communities. Really, really fascinating. And when people get determined, when it's life or death, it's amazing what they can accomplish, especially in large numbers.
Yeah, this may be a hard question to ask, but we touched on this in the report. And I'm sure that you guys continue to do research to keep yourselves up to date, and we're going to be staying on this future of medicine thing for a long, long time, because that's what we do at the JI, as you know. But when do you think we won't be using chemotherapy anymore to treat cancer patients? Is it too early to make that prediction? I know we're making great progress. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll let you off the hook on that one.
Hey, that's for the next report. We'll figure that one out and get back to you on it.
So I just got to ask you, when you go into a bar, Josh, and you tell people that you're a futurist, does everybody kind of hoard around you and buy you drinks, or what? I mean, I got to imagine that's a pretty hip line to. I'm going to try that. I'm going to try laying that down myself, actually.
Yeah, that is I don't know. You meet a lot of skepticism. I rarely lead with futurist. I prefer to have someone else apply the label. But yeah, people will give you a hard time and ask you what things you already predicted and what's the craziest thing you're predicting now. So that's it's always fun.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of the report, and we've covered a lot with you today. But we also like to give our listeners an opportunity to get to know our guests a little bit better. So I've got a few rapid fire questions. Off the top of my head, I'd like to ask you. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what was the last book you read?
Agency by William Gibson.
What is a pet peeve of yours?
I'm an English major, so tons of word-related pet peeves. I think the phenomenon whereby words go from being the wrong word through widespread use into being accepted, that's a pet peeve of mine. So the one I'm hearing and flinching at a lot and trying to bite my tongue is honing in. People talk about honing in on something, and it's homing. People homing in. You home in, you hone your skills. Okay,
I'm learning a lot today. What person or thing inspires you?
Super inspiring to me are healthcare workers, first responders, frontline workers over this pandemic.
I couldn't agree more. Last question. What is the first thing you're going to do when this doggone pandemic is all over?
When the pandemic is over, one thing is I'm going to get back on the squash court. I used to play a lot of doubles squash. It's fun. It's like being inside a pinball machine. And that has come to a screeching halt, which is a drag. Now I have to compete with you over the Peloton, which is unrewarding for me anyway. And so that's one thing. The other thing is I'm going to get on a plane. I'm going to go take a surf trip. That was something I was gearing up for, coming up on the 50th birthday, and COVID kind of put a stop to that. So that's number 2 is booking that trip.
Josh, fascinating conversation. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Bill, it's been a blast. It was so much fun working on the project with you originally, and I can't wait to get the band back together. It'll be a blast.
The feeling is mutual. To our listeners, thank you so much for your great support of the Jacobs Institute. Please stay safe, stay healthy. Until the next time, good day.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to be the first to know when there is a new episode, make sure to subscribe and recommend to a family member, friend,
colleague, or your social media followers?